Isaiah 2:2-4 records one of the boldest visions in the book of Isaiah. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised among the hills, and all nations will stream to it. At first glance, several of the primary elements of prophetic eschatology are found in this passage. The reference to the last days. In fact, it's the only reference to the last days in Isaiah. The description of Jerusalem, Zion, as a world center to which the nations are drawn. Pervasive peace, and perhaps, taking verse 2 literally, even cosmic upheaval. Will Zion replace Mount Everest in the Guinness Book of World Records? As Chris Seitz has noted, such lofty heights, pun intended, are not reached again in the book of Isaiah until chapters 60-62. But can this passage, Isaiah 2:2-4, be termed eschatological? Hugh Williamson translates the initial phrase simply as, and in a future time. Is it typical of Isaianic eschatology? Is its view of the future similar or even compatible with that found in Isaiah's climactic passage in 65:17-25? If so, are there unifying elements in the eschatological prophecies contained in the book of Isaiah, and how can they be synthesized? Or, to refer to this presentation's title, illustrated on the cover page of the handout, how can one construct a unified eschatology from a book that speaks both of a harmless viper and an undying worm in Israel's future? Beginning to address these and other issues are the purpose of this presentation this afternoon. If you can see that picture by Edmund Hicks, there's a shadow under the hands of the boy and the girl, so they actually have their hands over the hole of the viper. It's a little hard to see it, but that's what's represented there. Well, I'd like to start with a few personal methodological confessions. Supposedly, I'm an expert on the book of Isaiah, having written a dissertation and been teaching it on the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral level. But in comparison to a book like Ecclesiastes or Judges that I feel like kind of have a grip on, whenever I approach the book of Isaiah, I feel like someone trying to put their arms around a giant redwood in Northern California. I can just get around so far, but I can't get in my grasp. And so even though I'm writing a commentary, I finally will be forced to take a stand on some of the issues where I have simply kind of cherry-picked individual passages and issues and themes for publications and conference papers and even choices in a Hebrew Jesus of Isaiah class, as opposed to making up my mind and putting it on paper for every single text in the book and their interrelationship to one another and to the rest of the canon. Well, I'm still overwhelmed by the book of Isaiah. And maybe you'll notice that even when you ask questions this afternoon. And I'm often getting lost in the imagery. One of these great books is this book by Brent Sandy, Plowshares and Pruning Hooks, Rethinking the Language of Biblical Prophecy and Apocalyptic. I heard Brent Sandy deliver this book chapter by chapter, year by year at ETS papers. And I always was impressed by the thoroughness of his paper presentation and the provocativeness of his engaging how does prophetic imagery work. And then I always asked him, but what's the reality behind all of that language? Is it actually referring to something? Is there some kind of fulfillment that we should actually be expecting? Or is it just all imagery? I didn't always get a good answer from that one, but I appreciate the book. I am a recovering premillennial dispensationalist. I grew up in a fundamentalist independent church in southeastern Wisconsin on Lake Michigan. Every year we had a prophecy conference with a professor or two from Dallas or Moody. And I still remember my mother writing to me when I was teaching in Gießen, Germany, and said, the prophecy conference this year was a little disappointing. There wasn't anything new. And I said to her, Mom, there hasn't been anything new in prophecy in 2,000 years. A number of years ago, I was teaching a course, an intensive course to mainland Chinese in Hong Kong, and I was asked to deliver a lecture on what would the 8th century prophets say about the current economic crisis in the world. It was a number of years ago. And I had actually a student from Hong Kong who was actually at Wheaton who was going to be in the audience in Hong Kong, and I asked her, how should I address that in light of what was going on in Hong Kong about 7 years ago? And she said, well, just say nothing. The 8th century prophets have nothing to say with what's going on then or now in our world, in a kind of prophecy fulfillment, Isaiah in one hand and the newspaper in the other. I've been framed in that direction. I still probably have primarily premillennial instincts. I dare say that in this context where Vossian is a little bit different. And because of my training at Yale with Reverend Childs, I am permanently canon conscious. But I am trying today to kind of bridge what are my canonical instincts from my work at Yale and since then, in terms of how it was formed hermeneutically, theologically, and the concerns and emphases of the Vos Center here at Puritan Reform. And this is the first time I've been on campus, so it's nice to be here. I knew the name, but I didn't know exactly where it was, and of course, MapQuest got me here without a problem. I want to start with some foundational definitions. Biblical theology. In his inaugural address as the professor of biblical theology at Princeton Seminary, May 8th, 1894, Gerhardus Voss stated that biblical theology, rightly defined, is nothing else than the exhibition of the organic progress of supernatural revelation in its historic continuity and multiformity. Klink and Lockett, where they categorize various models of biblical theology, call this, BT2. I'm a BT4 because of my background. But Lockett and Klink categorize Voss's understanding of biblical theology as a history of redemption approach. And they say the task of this approach is to discern the historical progression of God's work of redemption through an inductive analysis of key themes developing through both discrete corpora and the whole of Scripture. Major themes such as covenant or kingdom constitute the theological connecting fibers between the Old and New Testaments, and these themes necessarily run along a historical trajectory, giving fundamental structure to the theology of the Bible. The definition that I published in a 2010 journal article really defines the discipline quite similarly. Second category, theological diversity. Both Vos and I acknowledge the presence of theological diversity within the Scriptures. How could you not? Kevin Van Hooser sanguinely claims it is possible to view canonical diversity not as a problem to be solved, but as a blessing to be received with thanks. He calls it Pentecostal plurality. And in fact, the opening remarks by Dr. Timmer regarding the valuing of the contribution of biblical theological diversity from Vos is really what Van Hooser is saying. However, progressive evangelicals like Peter Enns and Kenton Sparks, they actually gave themselves that label, progressive evangelical. They see it quite differently. Enns says, diversity found in the Old Testament can lead critical scholars to conclude that the Old Testament is full of contradictions and hence a quaint record of conflicting human opinions. And Sparks says, at face value, Scripture does not seem to furnish us with one divine theology. It gives us numerous theologies. Nevertheless, diversity is not necessarily synonymous with or a euphemistic substitute for discrepancy or contradiction. John Goldengay, in his published dissertation, really still the best work on unity and diversity in Old Testament theology, he distinguishes 4 degrees of theological diversity: formal, contextual, substantial, and fundamental. For Goldengay, only the last category, that is fundamental fundamental diversity, presents a problem. The other 3 really could simply be complementary perspectives. in Van Hooser's sense, that is, a theological enrichment rather than an apologetic burden. In this lecture, I will be focusing a little bit more on the challenge posed by theological diversity within the eschatology of Isaiah and how it's been problematized by many scholars, and giving a little less attention to the complementary nature, but maybe that'll come up a bit more in the Q&A. Now, I assume some of you are familiar with this collection of essays by Vos, the eschatology of the Old Testament. It was edited by someone else, so it's kind of put together, so it's not really a coherent collection in a sense. Some of the chapters are 3-4 pages, and then it has a 20-page section at the end, which it calls additional passages from Vos. So it is not a kind of coherent eschatology, but I drew on this as fully and originally as I could to kind of illustrate and interact with in this lecture. Vos says that eschatology is composed of two characteristic elements: the limited duration of the present order of things and the eternal character of the subsequent state. That's pretty simple definition. He distinguishes between individual and collective, or national eschatology, and says, broadly speaking, the Old Testament trail does not run from individual to the nation, but rather from the nation to the individual. So national eschatology is earlier in terms of kind of the history of Revelation than individual. And he does write about individual eschatology, but really we're talking more about collective eschatology in this lecture today. Eschatological diversity and biblical theology. Although 2 centuries of scholarly debate concerning the proper terminology for describing the last things have failed to achieve a consensus, John Goldingay, in his T.T. Clark ICC commentary on Isaiah 56 to 66, really gives as good a kind of set of diverse categories for eschatology that I found anywhere. And I've listed there in your handout. Notice the diversity reflected here. Eschatology can be individual, communal, worldwide, or cosmic. Secondly, it may involve an end followed by nothing, historical experience giving way to timeless blessing, or a new wholesome era of history and experience following our flawed era. Thirdly, it can involve God putting that ultimate purpose into effect now through events that can be seen in the world or at some time in the future by means not presently seen. Fourthly, the coming of this new age may be gradual or involve a dramatic transformation, reversal, or discontinuity. And fifthly, eschatology can imply a future that's imminent or one that's far away. We could spend the rest of the afternoon just talking about those 5 sets of categories, but I really am not quibbling with his categories. They are represented in the prophetic corpus. And it does give a striking summary of the scope of the diversity related to our topic this afternoon, unity and diversity in the eschatology of Isaiah. So what's at stake here? Eschatological diversity. Most treatments of prophetic eschatology, including the book of Isaiah, emphasize this diversity. According to Ernst Jenny, it's impossible to synthesize even the various eschatological expectations in 2nd Isaiah into a relatively firm pattern of end-time events. Ein festgefügtes Schema. Paul Hansen, in his work on apocalyptic, saw proto-apocalyptic in 2nd Isaiah, early apocalyptic in Isaiah 24 to 27, 34, 35, and 60 to 62, and full-blown apocalyptic in chapter 56 and 66. But in a later publication, he reduced his list considerably. On the one hand, Norman Wybray notes that there has been considerable discussion as to whether the message of Deutero-Isaiah, and I'm using their terms, it's not my term, but that's their scholarly term. I have written in defense of the unity of Isaiah, not just compositionally, but even potentially authorially in several published articles. But I'm using those terms because that's the terms that the scholars I'm citing are using. He says there's been discussion as to whether the message of Deutero-Isaiah, quote, is properly to be described as eschatological, while Hans Wildberger, though eliminating many eschatological elements within Isaiah 1 to 39 as secondary additions, nevertheless characterizes Isaiah as one of the fathers of the eschatological understanding of history, even the clearest of those among the pre-exilic prophets. On the other hand, according to William Dumbrell, Australian, evangelical, Isaiah 40 to 55 are almost entirely eschatological, and 56 to 66 represent a blend of history and eschatology, which expand upon 40 to 55. And Jeffrey Grogan, who wrote a commentary on Isaiah in the Zondervan Expositor series, the message of Isaiah as a whole, he says, is strongly eschatological. In sum, considerable diversity is claimed within the eschatological visions within the book of Isaiah, and the label eschatology remains disputed. So such diversity is viewed as reflecting the creative utilization of a wide range of Israelite traditions. Think here especially Volume 2 of Gerhard von Rath's Old Testament Theology, as indicating a progressive development of eschatological expectation within the Isaianic school, which is one of the views of how the book came to be. A series of disciples carried on the legacy of the great prophet, what we call a second group, producing second Isaiah, and a third group, and maybe even more, but there's really no textual evidence that there were ever anything like a school of disciples working with the prophetic corpus. Thirdly, as being attributed to a number of authors and editors over the course of 3 to 5 centuries. So it's typical in biblical studies today to talk about a half a millennium, at least, of the compositional growth of the book of Isaiah. It's not just this simple 1, 2, 3 Isaiah. Basically, they would date parts of Isaiah all the way down to the reference in Ben Sira and the great Isaiah scroll from Qumran. They can't go later than that because it's hard to date Isaiah later than the Isaiah scroll of Qumran. But if it wasn't there, they probably would get us down into the 1st century BC with material from Isaiah. Hugh Williamson says, the messages of the different parts of the book are so diverse that they cannot be understood as other than accompanying historical change, that is, moving through history and those historical changes being reflected in the different messages. Fourthly, this has been viewed then as militating against any attempt to synthesize a unified vision of the future within the book of Isaiah. It's precisely the extent of the theological diversity that leads John Goldingay in his book, a wonderful book on the theology of the book of Isaiah, published in 2014, to divide his discussion into 2 parts: the theologies in Isaiah and the theology that emerges from Isaiah. 2 very different perspectives. Eschatological unity. If some foundational eschatological unity could be discerned in the book of Isaiah, that would be viewed as reflecting a larger thematic and theological unity within Isaiah, and as suggesting a unified editorial or compositional purpose for the book. Those 2 claims have been the dominant emphasis within Isaiah scholarship, especially in the United States, for the last 3 to 4 decades. They're all talking about the unity of Isaiah, thematic, theological, not authorial. Largely fostered by the formation of the Book of Isaiah study group within SPL under the visionary leadership of Roy Malugin. And finally, if you could demonstrate some eschatological unity, it would be a sufficient basis for seeking a basic theological unity within prophetic eschatology as a whole, since Isaiah is considered foundational within the development of prophetic eschatology. Well, what's the methodological problem that we have to deal with here? Any synthetic study of prophetic eschatology has to address a number of methodological problems. First of all, as Werner Schmidt correctly noted, the Old Testament contains no doctrine of eschatology in the sense of kind of systematic teaching, but rather a variety of motifs and themes scattered across prophetic books whose contents can't be added together or harmonized easily. Secondly, the strongly metaphorical language in Isaiah, employing a rich diversity of poetic imagery, resists any attempt to reduce it to a concrete future prospect. The utilization of images, and again I refer to the book by Brent Sandy, from a wide variety of Israelite traditions, restoration of unspoiled paradise-like conditions, reversal of covenant curses, return to the splendor of the united monarchy, everyone under their own vine and under their own fig tree, Micah 4:4 and 1 Kings 5:25, make it difficult to determine whether these images are all pointed to a unified future scenario. For example, a number of recent scholars have questioned how prominent the theme of the second Exodus actually is in second Isaiah, despite the fact that it's basically taken for granted by almost all New Testament scholars as a given that they can talk about how that second Exodus theme from second Isaiah, is developed in Mark or in Romans or other books. But critics have included Hans Parstead, Leah Sophia Thiemeyer, and Chris Seitz. Thirdly, the lack of clarity regarding the temporal horizon of fulfillment makes it difficult to determine whether various prophetic utterances are pointing to the same future event. Johannes Lindblom concedes that the borders between historical prediction and eschatological prophecy cannot be drawn sharply, and that passages with an historical horizon can contain fantastic, even mythological elements. For example, the foreign oracle announcing judgment on Babylon in Isaiah 13 begins with organizing a universal army, verses 4 and 5, and cosmic disruptions, verses 10 and 13. Fourthly, and even more problematically, the lack of scholarly consensus regarding the compositional history of Isaiah can lead to circularity in arguing that specific passages are late, for example, because of apocalyptic, quote unquote, or cosmic universal elements that they contain, or that pre-exilic eschatology of Isaiah does not contain certain elements, because all the passages that actually are in chapter 1 to 39 that contain those elements have been basically dated later than Isaiah 1 to 39. So this does not exist in Isaiah because every passage in those chapters that actually has those features have been late dated and removed, as it were, from the original first Isaiah. Finally, despite much debate, no consensus regarding the proper definition of eschatology has emerged. William Dumbrell prefers a broader understanding of the term, the goal of history, and factors and events bearing on that goal. Well, scholars since Johannes Lindblom apply the term eschatology only to passages that speak of a new epic marked by radically transformed relationships when compared with the present. So more disjunction than continuity. Gerrit von Rott emphasized further that not only would the foreseen future epoch transcend the present conditions of history, but also go beyond everything that has transpired since creation. What's agreed upon, however, is that the prophets seldom actually emphasize the end per se, Hebrew achrit or chetz, but rather indicate that this thus transformed state will not end, like Isaiah 9, verse 7, from this day on forevermore. By selecting such a definition, however, scholars are implying that there is indeed a fundamental unity underlying all eschatological visions. That is, some common features that qualify a particular text to be called eschatological. And that history as we know it will not end, history as we know it will conclude with a bang, not a whimper. Well, how do we go about identifying eschatological passages? In the handout, I have the four key kind of Hebrew terms or phrases with all the occurrences of them in the book of Isaiah. Certainly the day of the Lord as a future day of judgment or deliverance, Yom Adonai. But it's not always apparent that the day frequently referred to in Isaiah is actually eschatological in nature. The term Yom Adonai actually only occurs in 13:6 and 9, referring to the judgment of Babylon. Chapter 2, verse 12 refers to the day of the Lord of hosts. We have a day of upheaval, a day of divine visitation, a day of vengeance, or simply in that day, Bayom Hahu, which occurs actually 45 times in Isaiah, almost exclusively in 1 to 35, most frequently in the context of judgment, to introduce the further activities, consequences, or responses to rabbinic acts of divine intervention in human affairs. Few of these passages actually portray a radical transformation as per the definition we looked at a few minutes ago. But the description of the cloud and canopy over Mount Zion in 4:2, the linking of the phrase in 10:11 to the peaceable kingdom, and the remarkable change in spiritual allegiances of Egypt and Assyria in chapter 19, 1625, and some of the other passages, really all could be considered eschatological elements. But it's apparent that the reference to a future Yom, day, referred to quite often in Isaiah, is not necessarily eschatological in nature. Interestingly, Vos understands the day of Jehovah not as a time designation, but as signifying light appearance, the coming of the day, the light appearance of the eschatological crisis. The Ahar root, afterwards, 26 times in Isaiah. Here again, it's not clear that all those occurrences are necessarily eschatological, and we notice the phrase in Isaiah 2, which Williamson simply translates in a future time, building on a longer article of that phrase throughout the Hebrew Bible by Talmon. The word eternity, olam, or ad, or netzach. Netzach is probably most clearly eschatological, but it only shows up 5 times in Isaiah, referring to the permanence of God's destruction of his foes, or of humanity's foes, that is death itself, 25:8, and the permanence of Zion's peace. The word ad, 7 times. The word olam, 45 times, is used really in 4 different ways in the book of Isaiah, and not necessarily, only one of those is like the unending messianic kingdom. To summarize, we go into some more detail there, but I at least have the text and the words. None of these terms, when occurring in a future-oriented text, is an unmistakable indicator of an eschatological oracle. You have to kind of work through the text, chapter by chapter, text by text, and decide on the basis of your own subjective judgment whether the future changes announced therein are clear, radical, and permanent enough to be labeled eschatological, at least if you use that definition that was suggested. You only have to look at the analysis of various prophetic texts in some of these prophecy handbooks to see what a hazardous subjective procedure that could be. I remember turning to one, and I was working on Isaiah 28, and I looked up, and lo and behold, the author of that handbook said, Isaiah 28 is about the Great Tribulation. And I said, and I've been studying this text all this time, for example, in a chapter of my dissertation, and didn't realize that's the Great Tribulation. Well, I don't think it is. But we have to come up with a different way of approaching this issue. So I'd like to suggest, kind of sketch 2 redemptive historical approaches to eschatological unity in the book of Isaiah. The first one would be the covenant foundations of portrayals of rupture and transformation. And again, mentioned in the definition of Lockett and Klink is that there is this study in the Vossian approach of various central themes like covenant and kingdom. So my suggestion would be one good way to find a kind of bedrock foundation for unity in eschatology and Isaiah is to show how those various covenants of the Old Testament are picked up and made a part of promises and also warnings of judgment in the book of Isaiah. Clements, Odendahl, Dumbrell, Watts, and others have emphasized the centrality of Israel's covenant relationships with Yahweh for proper understanding both of Israel's historical experience, historical books, the former prophets, and eschatological expectations. The same covenantal promises and threats that shape Israel's national experience throughout the Old Testament period also form the theological core of the prophetic proclamation regarding their future. According to Doug Stewart, in his Word Biblical Commentary on the first half of the Minor Prophets, nearly all the content of the classical writing prophets' oracles revolve around the announcement of the near-time fulfillment of covenant curses and end-time fulfillment of covenantal restoration blessings. They speak of little else than these two topics: how and why God's people may expect to be rescued and restored eventually, but initially judged. John Walton has described these as aftermath oracles. He actually counted a grand total of 122 aftermath oracles, that is, prophecies after judgment, what is going to come in the restoration. And he argues then that Israelite eschatology is entirely covenant-oriented. Again, not all those passages using these elements are necessarily clearly eschatological, but it clearly serves as a guarantor and sampler of the eschatological fulfillment to come, even if it has a more immediate fulfillment in Israel's near future. So when we turn to the book of Isaiah, we discover that most of its future-oriented threats or promises can be tied to one or more of the covenant provisions. And I've listed those covenants in all the relevant texts, not in the canonical order, but in the order that I'm mentioning them. The ancestral patriarchal covenants, the election of Abraham is invoked repeatedly as a basis for the continued existence of the people. Chapter 41, 8-10, 51, 1-2. Not only the judgment oracles refer to the formerly numerous descendants of Abraham, 10:22, 48:19, but Isaiah also speaks to the future multiplication of the people. Chapter 49, chapter 54. The people once again will be restored to the land promised to Abraham and claimed by Joshua. They will inherit a double portion in their land. And the blessings of a personal relationship with God will be restored. Again, I'll be God, you'll be my people, I'll dwell in your midst. That is being restored. Chapter 61, verse 9. Their descendants will be known among the nations, and their offspring among the peoples. All who see them will acknowledge that they are a people the Lord has blessed. From the beginning, however, Abraham and the descendants were not simply to be recipients of divine blessing, but also a channel of blessing to others. So the book of Isaiah repeatedly speaks of the nations in the future, not only acknowledging the God of Israel, chapter 45, chapter 60, chapter 66, but also benefiting from the covenantal blessings. Chapter 2, 2-4, Torah going forth from Zion, chapter 56, 3-8. Indeed, the God who sovereignly and graciously elected and blessed Israel can also work in the lives of Israel's archenemies, Assyria and Egypt, as described in the remarkable eschatological passage of chapter 19. The Sinai covenant sets down in its foundational blessings and curses, found especially in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, the rationale for all divine judgment on both Israel and, in some cases, the nations. Thus, weal and woe are integrally related within the proclamation of Isaiah, as Joseph Jensen has pointed out, contrary to some who would make a dichotomy and say, woe is early, weal is late. A contemporary scholar of Gerhardus Voss was Julius Wellhausen, and he argued that you have a clear sequence. All the early prophecies are doom and gloom, and the later prophecies are salvation. And he actually used that as a criterion for dating prophecies. However, because of God's eternal commitment to Israel as a nation, judgment will never be the last word. It's rather punitive, purgative, and restorative. Before the nation can be restored to divine favor, it must be completely purged of all wickedness and spiritual pollution. 1:24-28, 2:10-21, 4:2-4. This judgment eschatology is not distinct from or an earlier development, but rather inseparable from salvation eschatology. In the assessment of Sue Kim, and I want to mention this, the Oxford Handbook on Isaiah just was published in January of 2021, and his article on eschatology in Isaiah, which is in the bibliography, is the most up-to-date, comprehensive list of publications on eschatology in Isaiah and the prophetic corpus. So that's a very good place to begin. I didn't find the article as useful as I hoped it would be, but in any case, in the assessment of Kim, he says, quote, "From its very beginning, the book of Isaiah interweaves presentations of judgment and restoration upon Jerusalem and its people." And since the God who created both the cosmos and Israel, Isaiah talks about God baraing the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, the one who created the cosmos and Israel, who is carrying out that judgment, for example, on the familiar day of the Lord, is often described in more universal, even cosmic terms, even though a specific historical entity may be in view, humbling all who are lofty and arrogant, including trees, towers, ship's masts, we'd probably say cell phone towers today, the celestial lights being extinguished when Babylon is judged, the sky rolling up like a scroll when Edom is destroyed, chapter 34. Similarly, Vos notes how prophecy often puts immediately behind the currents of such an epochal crisis, not the provisional resumption of the average normal course of affairs as it existed immediately before, but delights to foreshorten the perspective so as to make it appear as though as soon as the proximate crisis is overcome, the final glory will burst upon the people. And he uses the familiar image of the intermediate plain, the ultimate mountain of fulfillment, and little hills in between, a common metaphor for not knowing how far it is from us to that peak, like when we overreach on an ambitious mountain hike and discover that peak is far further than we can accomplish in a day. And so too, the prophets and the people reading the prophecies were not really sure of how far it was from the plane they were standing in to that ultimate climactic peak, and even caused them to overlook the foothills in between because they had their eyes on that peak. That is Vos's description as well. So following the Assyrian attack on Judah and Jerusalem in Isaiah 28 to 33, this is Vos's example, we read in 29:17, "In a very short time, will not Lebanon be turned into a fertile field, and the fertile field seem like a forest? In that day the deaf will hear the words of the scroll, and out of the gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind will see." Immediately after the Assyrian crisis, this kind of eschatological end time healing and glory. Furthermore, since the exodus from Egypt was foundational to the establishment of the Sinai covenant and motivated by the ancestral promises, it's quite appropriate for the restoration of the covenantal promises after judgment to be described occasionally in terms of a second and greater exodus. Chapter 4, 5, and 6, chapter 11, 15, and 16, chapter 52, 11, 12. And by analogy, Mount Zion can be described as the new Sinai from which Torah goes forth, chapter 2. With the Davidic covenant and the Solomonic temple construction and territorial expansion, the ancestral promises achieve a new qualitative and quantitative fulfillment, according to 1 Kings 4:25. Eschatological promises that speak of a united and flourishing people, the geographical boundaries then achieved, a new Davidic ruler, boundless joy and peace, are not simply expressions for a bygone and golden era, but expressions of the full enjoyment of national covenant blessings. With the dual election of the Davidic king as the earthly representative of God's universal rule, and of Jerusalem, Zion, as God's earthly dwelling, the foundation is laid for another major component of Isaianic eschatology. The faulty and faltering leadership provided by the post-Davidic heirs to the Jerusalem throne, coupled with the divine assurance of a permanent dynastic succession, necessitated the promise of a new future Davidic king who would be divinely elected, endowed, and approved, not only establishing lasting justice and peace in the land, but also obeying the divine stipulations, thus keeping the people perpetually within the sphere of divine blessing. Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, Isaiah 16, Isaiah 32. Accordingly, Zion becomes the focus and locus of divine action, God chastening and defending his people, restoring and glorifying his dwelling, making it into a spiritual magnet to which the nations of the earth are drawn. And there I have references listed, chapter 1, 2, 4, 8, 14, 24, 28, 33, 35, 46, 52. Zion as the locus and the focus of God's work on earth, and the nations come. A further development of the election of Zion theme is the future manifestation of the divine kavod outside of the narrow confines of the tabernacle or temple, so that all flesh behold the kavod of Yahweh. And it turns night into day. Chapter 16, 19, 20. According to 55, verse 3, the unfailing kindness is promised to David in 2 Samuel 7 will be extended to all who come here and live. In fact, William Buchan, in his contribution to the Festschrift for David Klein in 2003, suggests that Yahweh's promise to David may even provide the theological bridge over the gorge between Isaiah 1 to 39 and 40 to 66. Because of the revelatory and salvific purposes of the divinely initiated covenants and the fickle allegiance and incomplete obedience of the covenant people, God promises to make a new and better covenant with his people after judgment is passed. People have been so corrupt that not only must judgment be executed against them, but a new basis for the relationship between God and his people must be established. 61 verse 8, in my faithfulness I will reward them and make an everlasting covenant with them. God will transform leadership, the people, society, nature, pouring out his Spirit from on high, chapter 32, 1 to 8 and 15 and 20. Forgiving sins so that disobedience will no longer threaten the covenantal blessings, chapter 33, verse 24. Because this is solely the work of God, it will be pervasive, glorious, and permanent. And the phrase no longer becomes a repeated phrase describing this future transformation. There are further aspects of the eschatological message of Isaiah that could be noted here, but these perhaps suffice to show how foundational and dominant the covenantal promises and threats are for the future-oriented prophecies of the prophetic proclamation. It's clear that some of these are more prominent in one section than another, but it's arbitrary to attribute divergent emphases to various authorial or editorial hands, when contextual considerations may be equally determinative. You could also notice here references to Edenic conditions or the mention of Noah, which may actually then go back to the Noachic covenant. Here we have chapter 24, verse 5. The earth is defiled by its people. They've disobeyed the laws, violated the statutes, broken the eternal covenant. Not exactly the language of Genesis 6:11, but the universal scope of guilt and consequences are similar. Since the people of the earth have violated the stipulations of the Noachic covenant regarding wanton bloodshed, Genesis 9, 5, and 6, they have fallen under a divine curse, Genesis 26, 21, and Christopher Seitz summarizes. In the poetic language of Isaiah 24, the author argues that the nations have returned to the violent ways of their forebears in the days of Noah. The world is not destroyed again by a 40-day flood, as God promised, but rather by century-long assaults of the nations. A second foundation for unity. Another approach that unifies the eschatology of Isaiah is to trace its development as you proceed through the main subsections of the book. Now, I summarized that in an article in the Dictionary for Theological Interpretation of Scripture, published by Baker, and you can see the details in the bibliography. But you see, as you move through the book, you alternate between Israel's present history, the near, and then even the distant eschatological future, and then back again. For example, after you have the description of Zion, who is a whore, it will be purged through judgment and then exalted above the mountains, that eschatological picture, and you have a paired eschatological picture in chapter 4, verses 2 to 6, which introduces or refers to the branch of the Lord, which may be the first mention of the Messiah in the book of Isaiah, though that's disputed. Tzemach Adonai, which is a messianic term in Jeremiah and Zechariah. And then you have in chapter 6 to 11 a focus on the divine king who Isaiah saw high and lifted up, the faulty Davidic king who won't test God and would rather trust a coalition with the Assyrians than trust God, and then the haughty Assyrian king who will fall under judgment in chapter 10, and then the coming Davidic king who will rule over a just and peaceful kingdom forever. Chapter 13 to 23, as Hayes and Irvine and Seth Erlandson have argued, I think persuasively, those chapters are primarily historical in focus, although many critical scholars date all that as post-8th century. They want to attribute all that to the background of the rising threat of Assyria and the nations that either are a temptation for Israel to trust in instead of Yahweh, or that would be a threat to Israel's national integrity. But in the midst of those chapters, the oracles about the foreign nations that affirm Yahweh's sovereign control over history of the nations, there are also eschatological descriptions of God's universal and climactic acts of judgment and ultimate purposes for Zion and the nations. Chapter 13, chapter 14, chapter 16, chapter 19, chapter 23. Chapter 24 to 27 contain eschatological accounts of two contrasting cities. The rebellious city that will be judged and destroyed amidst cosmic and universal judgment, and the city of God, whose inhabitants trust him in spite of the storm of divine wrath. And they sing his praise, for ultimately death will be swallowed up. 25, 7 and 8, 26, 19. Evil defeated, Leviathan, chapter 27, 1. Sin atoned for, quoted in Romans 27, 9. And the people regather to worship the Lord on Jerusalem's holy mountain, 27, 12, and 13. Arguably, Isaiah 24 to 27 look further into the eschatological future than even chapter 65 and 66, because it refers to the end of death and the raising of the dead, which I do not understand as national resurrection like in Ezekiel, although some do. But then Hayes and Irvine say, well, we'll understand this as in the hearts and minds and gratitude of their fellow countrymen, they will live on, right? They will not have died in vain. And so they will attribute this to Isaiah, but they have to radically reinterpret it as having nothing to do with either personal or national eschatology, but fond memories of the martyrs. So that raises the question about the ultimate, well, I skipped a page here. In chapter 28, 33, it's parallel to 7 to 12. Once again, you have the wavering king of Judah who is wanting to rely on Egypt against the Assyrians rather than on Yahweh. He is being contrasted then with the future Davidic king, chapter 32, and Yahweh, the divine king, in 33, who will bring eschatological justice, healing, prosperity, and peace. Chapter 34 and 35 form a theological transition to 40 to 66, contrasting the cosmic judgment of God's foes, exemplified by Edom, 34, and the eschatological restoration of his people to Zion, and the transformation of nature, chapter 35, confirming Yahweh's promise of protection to those who trust him in Zion by the defeat of Sennacherib, which is then going to be described in the immediately following chapters. Right? This raises the question of Zion's future. And so I'd say in the last 27 chapters, you have 3 sections of 9 chapters each. First, God is going to restore the people of the land through a political deliverer, Cyrus, and then he's going to return them to himself through the suffering of the servant, and then Zion can be glorified to full enjoyment of the covenantal blessings. And even some people from the nations will be incorporated into the people of God. On the other hand, there will be people who are part of the people of God, Israel, who will still be on the outside, who will continue and persevere in rebellion. So the last word of Isaiah, which was a surprise to me when I started looking at the book, is not the new heavens, the new earth, chapter 65 and the beginning of 66, but the undying worm, the judged people who the servants of Yahweh will go and look at with a worm does not die. The last word in Isaiah is the fate of the rebels within the people. Ironically, at the same time that people from the nations have now become among the servants and even potentially priests in the temple. So what can we say then about this? The transformation begins with the return of Yahweh to Israel, which in turn then leads to the return of people to Yahweh. That's the sequence we see in these chapters. Ricky Watts says that the bold and glorious promises of restoration that you see in Isaiah 40 to 55 were not fulfilled because they did not trust the wisdom of God in how he was going to bring about their deliverance from exile, for example, using Cyrus and calling him my anointed one, Mashiach. The faithful servant is going to deliver Jacob, Israel, from his blindness and bring justice to nations because of his individual covenant steadfastness. Israel's corporate covenantal history will be consummated. And as you journey through the book of Isaiah, the theme of the road connects, really, literally connects the main subsections of the book. There's a highway leading through the book. I don't see that highway as exclusively being the return from Babylon exile, but returning them to God, which is the ultimate journey that the nation has to undergo. Well, part 6, aspects of diversity in Isaiah's eschatological vision. Let's talk about some of those aspects of diversity that we haven't mentioned yet. And I'm going to give a brief response to them, so I'm not just going to let them stand as problematic diversity. We're doing okay on time there. I mean, I started a little late. Okay. Number 1, the agent of transformation. Most oracles in Isaiah focus on the climactic actions of Yahweh in meting out judgment or bringing salvation. Other texts emphasize a leader figure who produces or preserves such transformation. In fact, Vos distinguishes 4 different royal leaders, a Yahweh kingship, a non-royal figure of the Messiah, a royal Messiah not connected with David, and a royal Messiah dynastically connected with David. So he says the advent of Jehovah is a generic idea out of which the specific notion of a coming Messiah was generated. But I would simply say those are just 3 different descriptions of the Messiah with greater or lesser degree of descriptive specificity. And I would not distinguish 3 like he does. In Isaiah 11, justice for the poor, pervasive peace, restoration of the nation are all achievements of the future leader. But in chapter 65, when the familiar lion and lamb scenario is reprised, there's no trace of the king. And Jeffrey Grogan writes in his Isaiah commentary, the Christian reader must say, where is his beloved Savior in these closing chapters? Well, that's part of the diversity, right? You have this Davidic leader in the lion and lamb passage in chapter 11, and he's nowhere to be seen in chapter 65. Motir distinguishes 3 different kinds of messianic portraits. In 1 to 37, the king. In 38 to 55, the servant. In 56 to 66, the anointed conqueror. Most scholars say these are distinct to those 3 parts of the book, have no relationship to one another. In an article called The King in the Book of Isaiah, that's in the bibliography, I argue that there is an intertextual connectedness between the royal Davidic leader and the servant. And Hugh Williamson, in a series of lectures, said basically you have, in a sense, in these 3 portraits, what he would call kind of thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. That is, the figure from Isaiah 61 is fulfilling all of the tasks set forth for the Davidic heir in the first part of Isaiah, and the servant in the second part of Isaiah that remain undone. And that person in Isaiah 61 is going to carry that out. So you can see a connectedness there too. There's also a shift between the remnant in Isaiah 1 to 39. They've listed passages where you have the remnant references. A remnant, Shear, will return. Shear Yashuv, right? A word play off the name of Isaiah's son. A remnant will return. A remnant of Jacob will return to El Gabor, the mighty God. A restored people. So you have the beginning of this kind of first part of Isaiah, the servant. But then you come, the remnant. In the second part, you have a servant nation that is promised to be restored. Chapter 4, comfort, comfort my people, 40 verse 1, 41, 18. And then emerging with chapter 54 are a larger group of servants, plural, that is after you have the sacrifice of the servants in chapter 53 as the servant of the Lord. For the rest of the book, servant only shows up in the plural. And these are, in a sense, the servants of the servant. They are now the faithful people of God who are contrasted with the rebels for the rest of the book. I have a doctoral student who's defending his dissertation in May 5, who did a whole dissertation on the way in which the book of Isaiah picks up the seed, the offspring promise to Abraham, and develops it. And he argues that you have this kind of linear progression from the evil seed and the remnant in chapter 1 through the holy seed in chapter 6 to the fact that ultimately the servant is going to see seed because of the travail of his soul, and then the mother, the barren mother, is going to have innumerable offspring, and you have to lengthen the cords and strengthen the stakes because the little tent you have for Israel's population cannot encompass the offspring that have been promised to Abraham and that have been decimated in the judgments. It's been commonplace, thirdly, to characterize first Isaiah as Unheilsgeschichte, that is, announcing devastating judgment to be carried out against God's people and nation. And second Isaiah is announcing the inclusion of both Israel and the nations within God's salvation. But it's clear that the opposite element is found in the other section in abundance as well. So that it's been typical that historical critical scholars would attribute any message of hope in Isaiah 1 and 13 to a post-8th century redaction. Not only chapter 24, 27, or 35, but even Isaiah 2 and chapter 4, Georg 4, for example, eliminates them as later. Well, the relation between Israel and the nations is diversely described in Isaiah. Primarily centripetal, that is, the nations coming to Zion, but also towards the end of the book, going out. And I did a study of this for a Tyndale lecture, and I have my summary of my concluding points. The bottom line is there is this issue of nationalism versus universalism. Which one's early, which one's late? How do you bring together the fact that sometimes the nations, like in chapter 2, are just coming to hear God's Torah, and Israel, God's people, aren't even mentioned in that passage? Sometimes they're coming to attack. Sometimes they're bringing Israel back from exile. Sometimes they're worshiping alongside Israel. And sometimes they're serving Israel almost in abject humility or humiliation. How do you bring that all together? The bottom line is the book mixes them all the way from the beginning to the end. And you really can't come up with any kind of theory of compositional history that can untangle that web. Rather, in a sense, the nations are integrally related to Israel's fate as agents of judgment, as the recipients of judgment, and also the agents of restoration and the beneficiaries of restoration, so that Israel, both in judgment and in deliverance, has an impact on the nations as well. And so you can read my points there as I summarized my study through the book, and saying, in the end, ultimately, the framing of the book from chapter 2 to 65 and 66 is more universalistic. And so reading it from the bracket, from the outside and then through, would give prominence or priority to a more universal read, and that Israel is receiving God's blessing, not only for himself, but as the ancestral promises in the Abrahamic covenant set forth for the benefit of the nations. And then finally, one can distinguish in Isaiah what Johannes Lindblom described as a national, more historical eschatology from a more universal and cosmic eschatology, a new heavens and new earth. certainly that kind of distinction is valid. But if you look at chapter 65, 70 to 25, where you have the new heavens and new earth, it's focused on a new Jerusalem. And the scenario is kind of typical Israelite lifestyle, building houses, planting vineyards, bearing children, but enhanced by the absence of any of the curses that are grounded in the Sinai covenant. And I've listed those curses where actually the exact same words are used there. Some aspects briefly of unity, to some extent picking up things that we perhaps touched on already. Throughout the book of Isaiah, the transformation of society is brought about primarily not by human agents, but by God himself. Righteousness and salvation are divine gifts. And even when a future Davidic ruler is announced, the Davidic messianic kingship is always subordinated to Yahweh's kingship. Secondly, the centrality of Zion in the eschatological vision is apparent throughout the book. Donald Gowan says Zion is not only the center of Isaianic eschatology, but of Old Testament eschatology as a whole. The Zion of the future is mentioned 20 times in the first part of the book, 12 in the second part, and 11 in the third part if you count it in those three parts. Even though the future of Israel as God's people is dominant in the prophetic proclamation, its future, even its ultimate destiny, is intimately tied to that of the nations. And the covenantal blessings that are to be restored to the nation following judgment are not simply temporary, but final, permanent, and immutable. Hans-Peter Müller speaks of the Endgültigkeit des zukünftigen Segen. God is the kind of, it's permanent. God's blessing will not fade away. But I would say, in keeping with the ancestral promise, the greatest of all the promises that are described in Isaiah 65 is the unbroken communion and communication with God. Isaiah 65:24. Before they would call, I will answer. That outdoes instant messaging, right, and texting. Before they will call, we have other passages. They will call and I won't hear because their sins have blocked the way. Well, I want to just end with an aspect of Vos's hermeneutic of prophecy that I was not aware of, and I have kind of quoted it rather fully because it has rattled my premillennial hermeneutical soul, because I was very prone, like many premillennialists, to be kind of dismissive of amillennial hermeneutics, saying it simply spiritualizes everything in a very subjective and uncontrolled way. And so I want to, again, quote simply from Vos at a bit of length here. It's also, I think, on your notes. And this has provoked me to think about everything I've said in this presentation and the question of what is the scenario, what is the substance behind the language, the imagery, right? The allusions to the covenants. He says, the prophets had to give the essence, that's the substance of the prophecy, in particular forms. Eschatological revelation is presented in the language of the Mosaic institutions. The New Testament first transposes it into a new key. Here in the New Testament, it's spiritualized. In the Old Testament, it is expressed in terms of perfection of the forms of Israel's theocracy. But this is all to be eternalized in the Messianic era and will be free of the vicissitudes of the present era. All this is the content of Revelation. A distinction must be made between the substance and the form of the revelation. These peculiar forms are used because they're the most suitable forms of the time in which the prophecy was given. So far as God's intent was concerned, the whole apparatus was symbolic. Only the embodied ideas are to be fulfilled. The prophets grasped in and with the form the ideal substance and did not clearly distinguish the two. Thus Isaiah teaches that all nations will rest and worship on the Sabbath at Jerusalem. It's a physical and logical impossibility, says Vos. The essence grasped in the form is different from the form being grasped at the expense of the essence. We find the picture. I'm still quoting Vos, not Schultz. the essence grasped at the form is different from the form being grasped at the expense of the essence. We find the pictures of the eschatological state in terms of the Holy Land, Jerusalem, the rule of the nations, familiar offices and organizations and rights, and temporal blessedness. Nonetheless, all this, when expressed in similar terms, was felt to be different from the present because it was represented as eternal. To the mind of God, all earthly apparatus employed is purely symbolical. To the people, in part to the prophets, the symbolic nature was not always perspicuous. In other words, it is in the essence of the prophetic proclamation that the unity of Isaianic eschatology is to be sought and found, and not in the form, which often appears to be irreconcilably diverse. Expressed most succinctly by Vos, we should learn from Peter and Paul this exegetical and theological secret. Do not handle the matter too much in the confusing details, but in its large, broad aspects. Perhaps that's precisely what I've done for the past hour. In conclusion, I suggest that despite diversity in imagery, agency, and emphases within the eschatological passages in the book of Isaiah, an underlying unity in eschatological vision can be discerned. A unity that unfolds in the course of the book, its coherence being grounded in the progressive, redemptive, historical fulfillment of the covenantal promises and curses. It is such a holistic approach, rather than focusing on individual texts and terms, that should guide us as we turn to eschatological texts in Isaiah to sustain our hopes as we face the traumatic events that we face now, and most assuredly will accompany us until the end of the age. Thank you.